Look at a map of the world in 1980. Look at the red. The Soviet Union and its satellite states cover an enormous fraction of the Earth's land surface. The Warsaw Pact stretches from the Elbe to the Pacific. Soviet client states dot the map from Cuba to Angola to Afghanistan. The military inventory is staggering. Tens of thousands of armored vehicles, the largest land army ever assembled. Nuclear warheads numbered in the tens of thousands. A blue water navy operating on every ocean. The parades through Red Square are real. The missiles are real. The soldiers are real. Now put down the map. Open the Ministry of Finance ledger. Because the ledger tells the story that the parade does not. It tells the story of a superpower that, by 1980, was running on fumes. An economy whose productive output had been declining in real terms for a decade. A system whose agricultural sector was so structurally inefficient that the Soviet Union, which sat on more arable land than any other country on Earth, was importing grain from the United States. A government whose entire capacity to fund the military, the party apparatus, the subsidized consumer prices that kept the population docile, and the foreign policy ambitions that stretched from Havana to Kabul depended on a single variable that it did not control: the price of oil. The Soviet Union was not a superpower. It was a petrol state with intercontinental missiles. Its outward muscle, the armies, the nuclear arsenal, the ideological reach, was funded entirely by hydrocarbon revenues. When oil was expensive, the system held together. When oil was cheap, the system had no other mechanism to draw on. And in the early 1980s, in the offices of the CIA and in the royal palaces of Riyadh, a small number of people understood this dependency with a precision that the Kremlin itself may not have fully grasped. They were not looking at the world with bullets and bombs. They were looking at it with the cold eye of forensic accountants. And what they saw was the Achilles heel the size of a continent. The Soviet economy's addiction to oil revenue had developed gradually and then absolutely. The great Siberian oil fields that came online in the 1960s and 1970s had been a miracle. The lucky discovery that papered over the structural cracks in a planned economy that was increasingly unable to generate the kind of productive efficiency that market economies achieve through competitive pressure. When global oil prices quadrupled following the 1973 OPEC embargo, and then spiked again after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Soviet treasury filled. The revenues from oil and gas exports provided the hard currency that funded grain imports, that kept consumer prices artificially low, that financed the military buildup, that underwrote the foreign adventures in Afghanistan and elsewhere. The miracle had arrived precisely when it was needed. The Brezhnev era, which lasted from 1964 to 1982, was built on this miracle. The stability of the Brezhnev years, the relative comfort of Soviet life in the 1970s compared to the privations of the Stalin period, the confident projection of Soviet power across the globe, all of it rested on a foundation that was not Soviet industrial achievement but Saudi geological coincidence. The oil price was high, the revenues were flowing. The system did not need to reform because the miracle was covering the cost of not reforming. The cracks were there, they were being papered over with petrodollars, and when the papering stopped, the cracks would be everything. William Casey understood this with exceptional clarity. Casey, who became director of the CIA in 1981 under the Reagan administration, was not a military strategist in the conventional sense. He was a Wall Street lawyer and wartime intelligence veteran who had spent his career understanding how institutions fail, the financial pressures, the structural dependencies, the hidden liabilities that make apparently solid structures suddenly give way. He looked at the Soviet Union, and he did not see an enemy to be confronted. He saw a debtor whose collateral was about to disappear. The question was not how to defeat the Soviet Union. It was how to squeeze the windpipe until the liquidity crisis became unsurvivable. The Reagan administration's strategy toward the Soviet Union, which has been discussed primarily in the language of military deterrence and ideological competition, had a financial dimension that was its most consequential component and its least celebrated one. The military buildup, the renewed arms race, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was designed in part to force the Soviet Union to spend money it did not have, trying to match capabilities that the American economy, with its far larger and more efficient productive base, could sustain far more easily. Every dollar the Soviet military budget was forced to expand was a dollar that the oil revenues had to cover. And the oil revenues were about to stop covering anything. The Saudi dimension was the pivot on which everything turned. Saudi Arabia, in the early 1980s, was producing oil at a level well below its capacity, maintaining prices at a level that kept the revenues flowing to every oil-producing state, including the Soviet Union. The arrangement suited the Saudis for their own reasons. High prices maximized short-term revenue, but it also happened to be the lifeblood transfusion that kept the Soviet economy functional. The conversations that took place between American officials and the Saudi royal family in the early to mid-1980s are not fully documented in the public record. What is documented is the outcome. In 1985, Saudi Arabia dramatically increased its oil production. The additional supply hit a market that was already showing signs of softening demand. The price did not fall gradually, it collapsed. If nobody has explained to you that the Cold War ended not primarily because of ideology or military pressure, but because a commodity price was manipulated and a petrol state's single source of lifeblood was cut off, subscribe now. Because the story of how the most powerful military machine in history was bankrupted by an oil price is one of the most important and least discussed strategic operations of the 20th century. Stay with us. The oil price collapse of 1986 was the cardiac arrest. In the first half of 1986, the price per barrel fell from around $30 to under $10. The Soviet budget, which had been calibrated on oil prices in the $25 to $30 range, was instantly, completely, and catastrophically wrong. The hard currency earnings that funded grain imports, gone. The revenue that subsidized consumer prices at levels that kept social stability intact, gone. The foreign exchange that allowed the Soviet Union to operate as a global power, funding client states and maintaining its international presence, gone. The dam had broken, the floor had fallen out. The system that had been running on the miracle of high oil prices for 15 years discovered, in the space of a few months, that the miracle was over. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had taken power in March 1985, inherited a system already under severe fiscal pressure. The oil price collapse turned that pressure into a crisis from which no amount of political creativity could rescue the existing structure. The reforms he launched, glasnost, perestroika, were not primarily ideological experiments. They were desperate attempts to generate the kind of economic efficiency that the system had been able to avoid building during the years of high oil revenue. They were the actions of a man who had opened the ledger and understood what he was looking at. The Soviet economy was not struggling. It was an organ failure. The only question was whether it could be restructured fast enough to survive, and the answer was no. The human cost of the collapse was expressed in the most immediate and visceral terms in the shops of Soviet cities. The subsidized consumer prices that had defined Soviet daily life, the cheap bread, the affordable housing, the guaranteed employment, all of these required a revenue base that no longer existed. The empty shelves became the visible face of a financial crisis that had been invisible to most Soviet citizens for most of their lives. People who had never thought about oil prices in the global market, who had no framework for understanding the connection between a commodity traded in Rotterdam and the availability of food in Moscow, found themselves confronting the downstream consequences of that connection in their daily lives. The breadline was the final expression of a financial equation that had been solved at the level of petrodollar revenue and Saudi production quotas. The math had reached the street. The satellites went first. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. The Eastern European states that the Soviet Union had maintained in its sphere of influence through a combination of political pressure and economic subsidy, found that the subsidy had ended because the Soviet treasury had no money to sustain it. The liberation of Eastern Europe in 1989, which was experienced at the time primarily as a political event, was at its foundation a fiscal one. The Soviet Union could not afford its empire. It could not afford the interventions that would have been required to hold the empire together. The margin call had come. The collateral was gone. States that had been held in the Soviet sphere by the implicit threat of intervention were released, not because the ideology had changed, but because the check had bounced. The Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 25, 1991. The most powerful military force ever assembled by a single state, the inheritor of a revolutionary project that had defined the ideological architecture of the 20th century, ceased to exist not with a bang, but with a bankruptcy proceeding. The nuclear weapons were still there. The armies were still nominally functional. The institutional structures of the state were intact until the moment they were not. What was not there was the revenue to sustain any of it. An entity that had projected power across the globe had discovered that power, in the final analysis, is not ideology or military capacity or historical inevitability. Power is a budget. And when the budget runs out, the power runs out with it. The lesson that the Soviet collapse teaches, and that the Spanish Empire before it and every other petrol state and commodity-dependent economy since has demonstrated, is the same lesson in different clothing. An entity that funds its power from a single commodity it does not fully control has not built power. It has borrowed it. The commodity price is the margin call date. When it arrives, all the parades and missiles and ideological certitude in the world cannot cover the shortfall. The Soviet Union did not fall because its ideas were wrong, though they were. It did not fall because its military was defeated, though it was never tested. It fell because the oil price dropped $20 a barrel and there was nothing underneath to catch it. The windpipe was squeezed. The breathing stopped. The rest was paperwork. History is not over, it is underwritten.